Hello and welcome to my channel where I talk about different drivers and motorsport series from all around the globe. However, today's video is going to be about Formula One. As you probably know, Formula One has been in its mid-season summer break and it's almost coming to a close. And I thought it'd be a fun idea before it's over to kind of look at the teams and drivers this year and to give them a grade based on their performance so far. Now, this video is going to be about the teams, and when I try to grade both the teams and the drivers, I want to try to keep the performance of one from affecting the performance of the other. In other words, crashes and mistakes not affecting the team, and strategy and car performance not affecting the score of the driver. That being said, it's not totally possible because of course they are two sides of the same coin. But anyways, moving on to the first team, which will be Red Bull. Now, they've not always been the fastest car on track, but they have been pretty close. They did, however, have some reliability issues, especially at the beginning of the year, and that could also be seen through their junior team, Tauri. They have taken over a greater responsibility in their engine manufacturing process this year from last, and considering the amount of testing they had this year based on their results in the constructor standings last year, you could say their performance is pretty impressive. They're not always the fastest car, there have been some reliability issues, but there's not really been any major strategy blunders. So with all this in mind, I think an A is a pretty fair grade to give them. It's not perfect, but it's pretty good. Next up is Ferrari, and they probably have the fastest car on most weekends. And that's really impressive when you consider the improvement they made from where they were at on the grid last year. That being said, they do have a lot of reliability issues in both their own car and their customer teams with their engine. And when it comes to strategy, I think some people's reactions are blown a bit out of proportion. However, that being said, they've still made some pretty poor blunders on track this year. I would almost give them an average of C, because this is kind of just what I expect from Ferrari after years of being Ferrari. But in all seriousness, the improvement in performance is really impressive, but the reliability issues and strategy issues definitely put them below average. It might be a little harsh, but I think I'm going to go for an E for now. Next team is Mercedes, and this year has been a bit of a disappointment for the team, which has been used to being so dominant in the years past. It has been impressive to see them go from a sort of midfield car to front of the midfield and even on the back of the podium, which they've been on pretty consistently in the last few races before the break. They've also had pretty good reliability in their car, and it is a bit of a disappointment when you consider the history of the team, but also considering the amount of development and testing time they had from their finishing position in the Constructors last year to this year, it's still pretty impressive. When we take that into consideration, plus the improvements this year, good reliability, and pretty decent overall strategy, I think a B for the team is pretty okay. That could continue to improve as the year goes on, or it could reduce if for some reason they start going backwards down the grid, but I don't see that happening. Next team is Alpine, and they're kind of at the average where they are usually in the field from the last few years, a solid midfield car. And where you could see that as average, you also have to consider that with the new regulations and development, they have a big company behind their team with a lot of money in Renault. With that in mind, I think a lot of people really expected more from Alpine, the team itself included, and it almost feels like a bit of a disappointment. You could say it's average, because they're about in the same spot as they are every year, but for the disappointment, I'm going to go with a D for disappointment, probably. Now, where Alpine is usually consistently mid-pack, McLaren have flip-flopped from pretty okay, front of the midfield, back of the podium, to struggling on some weekends. They really seem to struggle finding consistent pace in their car from weekend to weekend. However, in the latter half of the first part of the year, they do seem to have a little bit better grasp on the situation they have with their car. With that being said, with the ups and downs, I think I'm going to put them at an average C for right now. I think it's a step backwards from last year, but with the ups and downs, it's kind of hard to determine, and I think we'll have a better picture by the end of the year. Next team is Alfa Romeo, and they've already scored nearly quadruple the amount of points this year that they have for the whole entirety of last year. At the beginning of the year, they also were the only team to meet the weight requirements set by the regulations. And it does seem like some of the performance as the season has went on has dropped off a bit compared to the beginning of the year, and I largely think that's down to other teams developing and catching up with, especially on the weight regulations for the team. Other than that, the car is usually broken. either on fire or failing engine with the Ferrari engine, or even issues of their own team's making and causation. With that in mind, it was a really impressive beginning of the year. They seem to have slipped off a bit, and the reliability is kind of dreadful. But I'm going to give them a B for now. I think by the end of the year, if they keep going backwards, this grade could maybe drop a bit. But for now, I'm going to go with a B. Next team is the Haas, and the Haas car was pretty slow last year, so the improvements to this year is really impressive. That being said, the team have kind of struggled to find consistent pace in their car from weekend to weekend. In addition, they've lost a lot of points as a team due to some of their drivers crashing into things. There have been some reliability issues as well as a few questionable strategy calls, but when you take everything into consideration, I think the team as a whole is actually behind in points where I think they possibly have the potential to be if they A, figured out their car setup better, or B, just brought the car home in the points where it belongs. That being said, I think the team's improvement is really impressive, so maybe a B is fair for now. And last of the Alpha teams, and that is Alpha Tauri. Now, I feel like for this team, it's been a step backwards this year for the junior team, and I wouldn't say I really expected them to really take a step forwards with new regulations, but it just doesn't seem like a very Alpha Tauri year. Now, they have lost a lot of points and finishes due to their drivers hitting each other drivers, and walls, but they were never really at the front of the midfield for most of the races this year anyway. And with that in mind, it feels like a below average performance, so maybe a D. And now for the last A team on this list. Not A ranking, but Aston Martin. Since rebranding as Aston, it seems like the team keeps taking steps backwards down the grid. And when you consider the regulations, the amount of finances, a lot of people expected a big growth from the team and its drivers included. If it was based purely on letdown, I would probably go with an E. I think one of their saving graces is their good strategy and ability to tire save, which has gotten them ahead of some faster cars on track. When you consider the performance of the car, they have managed some decent finishes, so I'm not going to go for an E, but it still feels below average with the regulations, so a D. And the final team on this list is Williams. And I think the Williams car is actually more competitive this year, but if you look at just points, it doesn't really look that way. But when you look at the average finishes are slightly better than last year. The team have made some decent strategy calls that have gotten them ahead in the field, ahead of some faster cars, for some decent finishes. Considering everything, I think it's actually a small improvement from last year, but I think they could have done better if they would have had more development time. For that reason, I'm just going to give them a C right now, because I'm not totally sure where they're at. And now looking at the end where I've ranked all the teams, I think things look pretty fair. Of course, there's a few that I feel maybe should be a little bit higher or maybe a little bit lower, depending on how much you value improvement from last year and outright speed versus reliability and strategy. You could rank a team like, say, Ferrari higher or maybe even lower. I do feel like maybe I've ranked them a tad bit harshly. That being said, though, what do you think of my rankings and reasons, and where would you put the teams? Be sure to let me know in the comments down below. And if you like this kind of stuff, then come back in a couple of days and hopefully I'll have a video ranking the drivers, which should not make anyone angry in the slightest, but I'll try to be as fair as I can. But that's all for now. Thanks for watching, subscribe if you like to, and I'll see you next time on Driver Profiles. Next is Alfa Romeo, and they've already scored quadruple, not two,